国际媒体法新社曾经会整2024全球5场最受瞩目的选举，如今有4场已经尘埃落定，包含俄罗斯普丁继续连任，印度莫迪持续掌权，整个欧洲民粹主义浪潮兴起，极右派势力继续赢得政权，以及墨西哥首位女总统诞生。薛恩鲍姆 Claudia Sheinbaum 虽不是右派领袖，但她却是倡议左派民粹主义和民族主义。现任总统欧布拉多数十年忠心耿耿的门徒，就算美国总统还不确定由谁担任，从近期刚举办过的电视辩论来看，川普跟拜登争取民粹主义领袖的头衔是非常明确的。世界趋势在民粹主流民意下，各国启动保护主义，施行关税政策，而经济报复也将是可预期的结果。
I think when Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, famously described wanting to create a small yard with a high fence, nearly 2 years ago now, the idea then was to try to have a relatively limited form of competition, or limited form of protection, and therefore manage competition. But since then, we've seen almost an accidental expansion into areas of biotechnology. It was meant to be just quantum, AI, semiconductors. Now it's biotech, it's aspect of electric vehicles. People are not quite sure, would it be cloud computing? Where do you draw the line?
美方继续将经贸问题政治化，进一步增加对华关税，是错上加错。
Between the United States and China, a kind of key constituency and almost swing vote between the two of them is the European Union. Europe, for what it's worth, does share broadly some of the American concerns about Chinese economic practices, but there is still overall in Europe a hesitance to go down the exact same road that the United States is going down when it comes to China.
Whether Biden would institute additional tariffs against China during a second term is unclear. A spokesperson for Biden's re-election campaign told the Journal that Biden is taking a targeted approach to protect American workers and industry.
The U.S. is no longer satisfied with cutting its own imports from China. Lately, it is pressuring its allies and trading partners to do the same. Under pressure from the U.S., Mexico announced last month new tariffs on 544 products entering Mexico that increase import costs by 5 to 50% that would affect imports from China in particular. Following the U.S. decision to levy new tariffs on Chinese EVs, batteries, and solar panels, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called on other members of the G7 last week to show that they stood with Washington. I predicted 2 weeks ago that the European Union would announce tariffs of its own on Chinese EVs before the June 3rd deadline.
We must remember that Europe is one of the most open economies dependent on trade in the world. Moreover, within that, the US is the largest trading partner for the European Union overall. Therefore, any changes that we could see with regards to trade policy, in particular here, I would mention tariff policy, will be a key focus for investors. So in my mind, the focus is really going to be on any transformation that we see in existing relations that could be to the downside. Now, we've heard a lot of talk already on this election campaign about the potential for tariffs. We've seen this in previous episodes. And the response from the European Union has been to retaliate to those tariffs. Therefore, this will be an area of concern. But as I said earlier, this really does matter for Europe as an economy that is very heavily dependent on trade.
然而，关税之火不会只烧向中国。当美国射箭画靶，对中国展开贸易制裁，当 Mega 喊得震天嘎响，正反两派的意见也在美国国内掀起热议。
Trump's proposed 10% tariff on all imports could cost the U.S. consumers more than $300 billion a year.
The irony here is that while both Trump and Biden talk about the importance of reducing inflation, tariffs actually will increase prices.
American firms have to pay the tariffs, then many companies, they need to recover the cost increase. So what do? They have to pass the cost increase to the consumers. It also contributes to part of the inflation that we're facing right now.
The Biden administration says its recent tariffs will not have an inflationary impact because the tariffs only target specific sectors.
When the Biden people say it's not inflationary, I don't know what they mean. And prices of those products are going to go up. We had an experience actually with steel and aluminum. We saw what happened with that. We had experience with tires during the Obama administration. They imposed tariffs on foreign-made tires. And what happened? The price of the tires went up.
The US has accused China of a practice called dumping, flooding the market with a surplus of goods, like electric vehicles or solar panels, at artificially low prices.
We've seen this story before, when the global market is flooded by artificially cheap Chinese products. The viability of American firms is put into question.
China has that surplus in part thanks to years of careful planning and massive government subsidies. But weak environmental and labor standards are also a factor.
The worry is that if we are just importing the lowest cost products, that it will undermine labor standards here at home and undermine the US economy.
Biden has kept Trump's China tariffs in place and recently announced new tariffs on Chinese goods.
I thought Trump was right to put tariffs on China. I think Biden was right to continue them. Not for punitive reasons, but because within the current system, China is not playing by the rules of the game.
The Biden administration's tariffs on China are targeted in the same sectors where it's investing at home, like steel, semiconductors, and clean energy. The goal is to protect the jobs created in those sectors from being undercut by cheaper imports.
You simply cannot say, I'm going to outsource the entire clean energy transition to one country and not have any of those jobs in my own country and expect there to be a country left after that.
We've tried neoliberalism. What happened during those 45 years was that wages stagnated, Wall Street exploded, big banks got bailouts. Most Americans really came out on the short end. And it pains me to say this because I was part of previous administrations. I was in the Carter administration. I was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. I think that these administrations accomplished a lot of good things. But looking back historically, those administrations did not change the neoliberal consensus.
Kim, some people were surprised when the Biden administration left a lot of the tariffs in place. And both sides seem to be able to say, well, we're doing it this way, targeted, whatever. But fact remains that we're using tariffs now. And most, at least over the years, most economists would not be in favor of using tariffs to affect whatever you're trying to do globally.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a good reason economists aren't in favor of tariffs as a good policy tool. First of all, they're a tax, and they should be best understood as a tax. Despite a lot of confusion about this issue in the Trump campaign, tariffs are paid by consumers. And this new proposal to put a 10% across-the-board tariff on absolutely everything Americans buy would be a huge tax that would disproportionately burden the poor and the middle class, and it would actually hurt our competitiveness by making it harder to make things in America because we're dependent on global supply chains. And if you can't buy something from Canada or the UK or any trading partner without a big tax, that's going to raise prices, fuel inflation, and be a huge shock to the American economy.
I would take exception to some of that. And I do think if you look at the entire international trading system, it is well recognized that countries are allowed to take tariff actions to counteract unfair practices, including unfair subsidies like Chinese excess capacity. You're also allowed to take tariff action to try to change bad behavior. And one key distinction, I think that's been lost in this discussion, one key distinction between the Trump and the Biden administration is that the Trump administration was actually using these tariffs to try to get more free trade around the world. And if you look at the China tariffs, when the Trump administration put those in place, it was to try to change China's behavior on intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer. And I'll acknowledge we have a mixed record there, but they did make some changes. And if you look at what the Biden folks have done, it's really just reaffirming the entire tariff regime, but without any attempt to engage with China and to change Chinese behavior. And I hear from a lot of businesses who maybe on one hand say, look, I don't want a bunch of new tariffs, but they say what I really like about what the Trump administration did is they used tariffs to fight unfair practices abroad. And right now we're doing nothing when other countries are trying to tax our technology companies. We've rolled back all the efforts to counteract digital services taxes. We're doing nothing to open markets abroad. And so I think you've got to look at this both from the perspective of inputs into the United States, but also using tariffs to fight bad behavior around the world. And that's something we just haven't seen out of the Biden administration.
当保护主义抬头， 关税成为外交经贸上的谈判武器时，它是不是也正为全球经贸带来重塑的契机？去年11月，彭博社做过一则专题 These 5 countries are key economic connectors in a fragmenting world 当中提到，在地缘政治影响下，全球贸易走向碎片化。当两强杠上有5个国家没有选择站队，他们在这个百年难逢的时间点，运用自己的优势，成为世界经济的 connectors。
And in 2016, we saw a vote for Brexit, an exit from the European Union in the UK, and the election of Donald Trump in the US.
That, in extension, triggered a big trade war between China and the US.
We've seen a global pandemic that has tested those global supply chains, and that has led a lot of countries to rethink offshoring production. We're seeing war in the Middle East. We are seeing coups in Africa. And those conflicts are leading people to question even more the benefits of globalization.
There is a group of economies who are navigating the middle of this geopolitical divide. You can call them the connector economies. They are not in the game of choosing sides. They are attracting factories from the US, factories from China, often located close by or in the same industrial park. They're importing from China, they're selling to the West, or vice versa.
We're at the very beginning of this story. The reality is we're not seeing the end of globalization, but we are seeing a reshaping of the global economy. It's an incredibly interlinked global economy that we live in.
Business will continue to be done. Money will continue to flow around the world. And even though there will be tensions at a government-to-government level, companies will look for a way around those political divides.
反移民是全球民粹主义的主轴，对抗中国则是美国为这个科目底下设立的大项目。就联合次要敌人打击主要敌人的战略而言，这绝对是政治正确。而中国并没有示弱，积极从其他国家以跳棋的方式前进欧美市场，即使这个方法欧美已经采取其他方式进行回堵。有财经专家研判，未来中国可能会将目标放在新兴市场与其他发展中的国家，这会对全球经贸产生什么样的影响，有待观察。而在进入全球经贸重塑期的时刻，我们要如何面对这场经济风暴？单靠政治或许无解，但是中国跳棋式的布局，台商已经开始学习，